Welcome to the Bali, a debate center in the middle of Amsterdam. Welcome to the third Follow This Investor Symposium. As you all know, next month all the oil majors will hold their AGMs, and there are some important decisions to make. There will be climate resolutions which come to vote, and we will have to vote about the climate plans of these companies. As you know, there will be 6 Follow This resolutions on the agendas next month, 3 in Europe, 3 in the US. As you've seen, the title of this symposium is How Investors Can Support Oil Majors to Curb Climate Change. And our ambitious goal for this 1.5 hour is to prepare you for the AGM season of big oil next month. And actually there are only 2 key words which describe this symposium. That's urgency and agency, and that's what we want to talk about with a lot of speakers who are ready to speak with us. And we simply start with the urgency. We have a highly esteemed scientist who will tell us how much time we have left to actually reach the Paris Climate Agreement. Then we will hand over his story to Mark Campanale of Carbon Tracker, who will tell us how fast the industry has to change. So when we've established the urgency, then we will talk about the agency with 3 investors, 3 representatives of institutional investors, and they will talk with us about the agency they have as an investors with engagement, voting, and eventually divestment. So let's start off with the urgency. Let's go to Utrecht, where Detlef van Vuren is ready for us to talk about the urgency of the climate crisis. Welcome, Detlef.
Good afternoon.
Let me introduce you by saying that when we, or many of us, were not worried about climate change yet, you were already writing your PhD thesis about climate policies. Detlef is a representative. He's a professor in the University of Utrecht, and he works for PBL, which in English is the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. And he's a co-author of the IPCC reports. He speaks on his own behalf today, but while he's a scientist, I'm not worried that there's any discrepancies. So, Detlef, welcome. Thanks a lot. Let's start with big history, with the big picture. What have we basically done since the Industrial Revolution as human species on this planet?
Yes, so since the Industrial Revolution, we have put more than 2,000 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere, and this has led to a warming now of about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And the impacts of climate change are noticeable. We see sea level rise, we see changes in ecosystems, we see extreme weather events. So I think there's no doubt that climate change is happening.
Just to get the figures right, how much CO2 are we adding every year now?
Yeah.
So we have 2,000, let me repeat for everybody, we have 2,000 gigatons of CO2 in the air right now, which causes more than 1 degree of global warming. And we're still adding. How much do we add a year, approximately?
Yeah, so every year we add another 43 gigatons of CO2. That's the number from 2019. As we all know, 2020 was slightly lower as a result of the COVID crisis, but we're already almost back to the 2019 level. So every year, another 43 gigatons of CO2.
Yeah, and can you picture what will happen? Can you tell us shortly? You already indicated what the results of this more than 1 degrees are. What would happen if we continue with business as usual and with the 43 per year and even increasing CO2 emissions?
Yeah, so we use computer models to make scenarios, and they show that with continuation of the current trend, we might add another 3,000, 4,000 gigatons of CO2 to the atmosphere, which would mean a warming on average of about 3 or 4 degrees. And IPCC makes an estimate of what this could imply, but that would mean much more sea level rise, floods, droughts, more extreme weather events, on a global scale negative impacts to agriculture, impacts on biodiversity, and even significant risks on large-scale tipping points in the climate system.
So this is a future we don't want, obviously, and so we're at 2,000 gigatons CO2, adding 43 a year. When we want to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, as agreed in the Paris Climate Agreement, how much CO2 budget, as it's always called, do we have left?
Yeah, so based on the graph that we just had on the screen, where we see cumulative emissions against temperature, you can derive that you can put about another 1,000 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere if you want to stay well below 2 degrees. And there is some uncertainty in this number. It can be 200 gigatons higher or lower, especially, for instance, depending on what you do on non-CO2. But it's somewhere around 1,000 gigatons of CO2.
Around 1,000, but with 43 a year, that's adding up quite quickly. And what if we would aim for 1.5, which most investors now are pledging to?
Yeah, in that case, it's only 450 gigatons of CO2. Mm-hmm. And if we compare that to the 43 that we are adding to the atmosphere, so that means about 10 years of 2019 emissions, and less if we would increase our emissions further. If we gradually, linearly go to zero, it means that you need to be at zero in about 20 years or so around 2040. It's not a large number.
Yeah. Is there any way we can postpone this deadline of 2040?
Yeah, so there are some options. So there is, for instance, reforestation, or maybe combining bioenergy and CCS a bit. But that's limited. We have a limited amount of area where we could grow bioenergy or forest. So maybe this is 200 to 400 gigatons of CO2. So maximum maybe another 10 to 15 years of time, which would mean that you need to be at zero mid-century. And then there is also the issue of equity, of course. So if the globe needs to be at 2050 at zero, and then some regions need to be earlier, because it will be harder for developing countries.
Yeah, and so, yeah, thanks a lot for making the urgency so clear. This is very clear. For 50 to go, we still put 43 gigatons a year in the atmosphere. So if we continue business as usual, we keep this flat. In 10 years from now, we have spent the entire CO2 budget for the 1.5 degrees limit. So the urgency is clear, but what can you say about the agency we have? What do we need to do to make sure we decrease emissions?
Yeah, so first of all, clearly we have to phase out fossil fuels. Luckily, we have some options. In the electric power system, also thanks to the development of renewables, we see routes to go to zero. And that has also the advantage that it's attractive to start using electricity wherever we can. So, for instance, also in transport. And that makes the transition much easier. That means also that there are some other areas where it might be a bit more difficult, where we are using heat, for instance, in industry. And there might be other solutions like CCS or hydrogen or bioenergy. Certainly efficiency. Efficiency will be a major part of the solution. And we have to reduce our non-CO2 emissions. So we can see the pathway that is out there to get there. It will be quite a challenging pathway, but there is a pathway.
So the technology is there, Detlef?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So we have urgency, we have agency. Let's turn to the audience. Betsy, do we already have questions from the audience?
There's no questions from the audience, Mark.
All right, then let me ask the final question to Detlef then. What's the most important thing we have to do right now as a world? What do we have to do about our energy system to have any chance to still meet the 1.5 degrees?
So at the moment, we're adding this 43 gigatons of CO2 to the atmosphere every single year. And that means that we're eating this budget really, really rapidly. And that means that the first 5-10 years are absolutely crucial. We really need to go in the next, before 2030 downwards, to have any chance of staying within that budget. Once we get this at the lower numbers, then we have some flexibility again, but we really need to get down from the 43 that we currently are.
Thank you so much, Detlef. Very clear. We will keep the 450 gigatons carbon budget in mind. We will hand it over to the next speaker, to Mark Campanale of Carbon Tracker, who will tell us what this means for the fossil fuel industry. Thank you so much. To thank you, there's a book on its way to your house. It's called The New Climate War, written by esteemed colleague of yourself, Michael Mann, who is also a veteran in climate change. And actually, I got the two words urgency and agency from this book. So it's on its way to your house. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And then we can move over to London to connect with Mark Campanale of Carbon Tracker.
Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Also from your study, as I can see. Let me quickly introduce you by going back to 2011. Please have a look at the cover of the Rolling Stone. In 2011,
Oh, look, it's me.
I was about to say, it's not a young Mark Campanale. It's actually Justin Bieber, for those who don't know. But in 2011, two bankers wrote a report about the consequences of acting on climate for the fossil fuel industry. And they concluded that a big part of their proven reserves had to stay in the ground. And then they actually went back to work, I think. But because Rolling Stone wrote an article about it, Global Warming's Terrifying New Math, where Bill McKibben actually quite eloquently explained how terrifying this new math was. They couldn't go back to be as the bankers, and they were forced to found Carbon Tracker, a think tank who since then explains to the oil industry and explains to investors how terrifying this math is. So let's start with the question, Mark. How terrifying is the math 10 years later?
Yeah, well, Detlef has got it right in his presentation that we have a much smaller carbon budget than we had from 10 years ago, and it's heading in the wrong direction. We have somewhere between 300 and, in our views, 300 and 700 gigatons of CO2 that can be emitted into the atmosphere before we exceed 1.5 degrees. And time is against us, so we think it's less than 10 years based on current emissions. And that first report, we looked at it through the lens of financial markets, which listed companies like Exxon and Shell and BP and Glencore and all the others own the reserves from which the combustion of which would lead to these CO2 emissions.
Okay, so to make this clear to everybody who forgot, can you show the carbon bubble one more time to show how terrifying this math actually is? So we've just heard from Detlef that we have a carbon budget of 450 gigatons CO2 to emit to reach the 1.5 degrees limit. How big are the proven reserves now?
Yeah, so on the top right there, you'll see okay, you've seen that. So what we've got here is that remaining carbon budget versus the reserves that we already know are there, the proven reserves. And obviously the red is far greater than the remaining carbon budget. That's why we call it a carbon bubble. 5/6 of known fossil fuels, proven reserves, will have to remain in the ground. There's no doubt about it. And that's the challenge we have for the decade ahead of us.
Okay, Mark, but yeah, as a shareholder in big oil, I have to defend them. And oil and gas companies say, okay, this could be right, 2,900 of proven fossil fuel reserves, but there's a lot of coal in there. So let's keep all the coal in the ground, then we can produce our oil and gas.
Yeah, I mean, even if we rapidly dial down coal, and we estimate at Carbon Tracker that we have to close one coal-fired power station every day to 2040 to get any chance to get to 1.5. Even if we do that, 2/3 of all oil and gas will have to remain in the ground. And there's a lot of infrastructure being built in gas, for example, today that we know will be stranded because we would have had a technology leapfrog. We'll have regulations and other interventions. Any investor now financing this kind of infrastructure is on shaky ground, in our opinion.
Yeah, so looking at this picture, basically, it's quite a hypothetical picture. It means we keep all the coal in the ground, then still the carbon bubble is twice as big as the budget we have.
I think that's right. Yeah.
But then again, to talk for the oil industry, they all think they are in this white circle. They all think they're in the carbon. They're within the carbon budget. And most important, what I hear a lot, we do a lot of engagement with oil company, and they all say, yes, this might be true. Of course, half of it has to stay in the ground, but we have the best barrels, the cheapest and the most environmental friendly. So we will be in the white area. So what can you tell the oil majors who have the best barrels?
Of course, they would say that, wouldn't they?
They say that, yeah.
Of course, they will say they've got the cheapest barrels. I think it's that the Americans call their gas the molecules of freedom. They think that gives them their right to produce. Actually, with the way we model it at Carbon Tracker, and you can see it there on the left, what you have there is a cost curve, which is that sort of squiggly line from the lowest cost barrels around $20 a barrel all the way up to over $100 on the top right. And what you've got there in the vertical bars is different scenarios from the International Energy Agency, the Sustainable Development scenario, the below 2 degrees scenario. And you can see the intersection points with those different warming outcomes. What we think will happen, and this is what we do, is we think all the companies that have and nation states which have high cost projects, the least economically competitive, they're the ones which risk stranding at first. And of course, there will be a lot of pressure on oil prices in the future from having to compete with low-cost renewable energy alternatives and electric vehicle alternatives, which are just getting cheaper and cheaper. On the right there, what you'll see there is a list of oil and gas companies which are listed, and you'll see Carbon Tracker's analysis of what percentage of their planned capital expenditure is unneeded in this world below 2 degrees scenario. The risk that investors face is billions and hundreds of billions being deployed of equity, and on top of that, trillions of debt in not just limiting to where they are now, but actually expanding production. And this is the real threat of stranded assets, of capital deployed that will never see the return on capital that's expected. And we can drill down at Carbon Tracker, company by company, project by project.
So let's name some names then, Mark. Can you show which capital expenditures of, let's talk about Shell, BP, the ones who are the most known for telling they're fully Paris-aligned.
We can do that.
How much capex do they spend outside?
So we have a team of 30 analysts, many of them ex-Wall Street, City of London. They look at all these projects, company by company, and we can calculate the percentage of capex there. And at 1.6 degrees, now why did we pick 1.6? Well, at 1.5, there is no space for any new capex for new production and exploration. At 1.6, there is some space for some. And as you can see through those names, your Shells and BPs and so on, a significant percentage of each of these companies' planned capex doesn't sit. And the reason for this is nations have a claim on the same carbon budget. Companies don't get their own. They're sharing it with everybody else. And so for everyone to claim that they're going to be a survivor, of course, is not possible. There's only one world. Each is competing for a remaining share of the same carbon budget.
So 70%, 58%, even 90% of spending is outside the carbon bubble. What, according to you, we discussed this before, but what, according to you, is a forbidding subtopic in the oil industry? What do they refuse to talk about, in your opinion? And I think you wanted to show us the IEA 7 principles.
Yeah, I mean, so what's clear is that nobody wants to give up production rights. And the interesting thing, and hopefully you'll show this at the International Energy Agency's 7 key principles for implementing net zero. When you go through those 7 principles, and you can look them up, none of them involve a reduction in the use of fossil fuels. Strange that, don't you think? Somehow we're going to achieve net zero without changing our use of fossil fuels at all. And if these are their key principles, I'd hate to think what the other principles are. And they're saying, if you don't like these principles, you can have these other ones over here. You know, I mean, it's a little bit like that. And I do find it's not being straight with people, actually, if we think about it. And there's a lot of discussion about negative emissions technologies and nature-based solutions. What we actually see in the plans in the next decade, Mark, is a planned increase in the production of fossil fuels by most of the fossil fuel majors, and they're all claiming these are net zero. We've got to remember, net zero is only one letter away in the alphabet from not zero.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Mark. So let me ask you the question I'm also going to ask investors later on. Do you think the oil executives will change on their own accord, looking at this research, looking at their plans for the next 10 years?
Well, I mean, if your livelihood is dependent on pretty much continuing to do the same, then there's only one group today that can throw that challenge outside of government, and that's their institutional shareholders. And that's why initiatives such as like the Say on Climate, the work that you're doing, Mark, with Follow This, the work that Climate Action 100 is doing, and we hear from Anne, is so important. It's important that the shareholders and particularly the institutional investors challenge management as to whether they genuinely have a 2 degrees aligned plan. And in Carbon Tracker, we're delighted to be providing the research that goes into Climate Action 100 and other initiatives to help inform on these key questions.
Thanks a lot. Let's see if there's some questions from the audience.
We have one question for you, Mark, which is whether the IPCC will adjust the carbon budget numbers this year?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a scientist, and there is some variation in the budget, as we know. If we take, again, the precautionary principle, whether the carbon budget is another 200 gigatons above or 200 gigatons below, the key point is that to allow enough time to make adjustments, particularly in heavy industry, cement and steel, construction, but also shipping and aviation, and to get off the use of particularly coal for power generation, we need as much time as we possibly can, whether the IPCC makes any adjustments in the size of the carbon budget. My view is we've already almost left it too late. We heard announcements from Joe Biden's administration that they may announce a cut of 50% in emissions by 2030 is what we're hearing. These are very, very ambitious numbers. And what we need is what we don't have, which is time.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question if there's time, Mark.
Yeah, please go ahead.
A question from Alex, which is, how useful are carbon intensity targets in your view, given the hard carbon budget numbers that have been presented?
Yeah, those not familiar with carbon intensity, the way it goes is if you're an oil producer, you dial in some gas and you dial in some renewables, and the per kilojoule of energy sold is, by magic, less carbon intensive than the previous kilojoule. And it allows you to double your production. So whilst your unit of energy sold may be less intensive, if you're doubling your production, your overall production is still more carbon intensive. And that's why Carbon Tracker, we really don't like intensity metrics. We think that they're a distraction from what we really need to be talking about, which is absolute cuts in emissions, which means, in our view, absolute cuts in production. And I think that's the challenge today, is metrics that monitor cuts in production of fossil fuels. And Mark, you know, I'm a bit of a fan of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, an agreement by countries and corporates to give up licensing rounds. On one side, you've got countries saying we support the Paris Agreement, and the same country or government is at the same time handing out new production licenses and coal permits. So this can't really work.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Very clear.
Thank you.
Thanks for making it to us very clear. That we really need change in the oil industry, and that we really need to talk about production cuts and emission reductions. I can tell you, I'm not so dead against intensity targets as long as they can prove that they lead to absolute emission reduction targets, and that's a thing the oil industry refuses to talk about. They're all talking about net zero by 2050, and then they say, yeah, that's an absolute target as well. Yeah, of course it is, because it's zero. But in the meantime, they only want to talk about intensity targets and not disclosing what this means for absolute reduction targets. Most of them even want to increase absolute emissions in the next decade. So yeah, that's also a forbidden topic, I think. Mark, thanks a lot. Thank you so much. There's also a book on its way to you. It's called Loonshots, written by Savi Bakal. It describes quite a good model for companies to enter in a real transition. With a lot of history in there. It shows, for example, how World War II was won with this kind of model. It's quite an interesting read, but I think it's one of the few books that gives a good idea of how a company can really get into transition. It's called Loonshot. I also gave it, by the way, to Bernard Looney, the CEO of BP. No pun intended. It's really a good book. So he also has it on his desk. So I look forward to discuss with you what you think of this model. But thanks a lot for now. And then we move to Rotterdam, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Farida, good afternoon. Thanks a lot for joining us from Rotterdam. For the audience, Farida is the Senior Responsible Investment Specialist at NN Investment Partners since 2017, actually. She studied sociology in Rotterdam, of course, and she's I can call it an alumni of Sustainalytics. The Dutch pioneers in ESG reporting. So welcome, Frida.
Thank you, Mark.
You've told me before, friends still sometimes ask you, why does a world improver like yourself, join the financial industry?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? And I think they're actually right in asking me that question. I've always been trying to sort of have sort of an impact on sustainability topics, right? I think that was basically my aim when I sort of started working. And I think I quickly realized that actually the financial industry has quite an amazing impact in terms of sustainability. And I think that's also the reason why I sort of joined that side as well, is to say, okay, how can we create that impact with the financial industry, and how can we move this forward?
So we plan to talk with you about, let's call it the Investor's Toolbox. The Investor's Toolbox to steer companies with a gentle hand, but in the right direction. So I'd like to go over with you basically the three options an investor has: engagement, voting, and divestment. Yeah. Engagement-led divestment, as it's officially called. Yeah. Let's start with engagement. Can you tell us how Nationale-Nederlanden does the engagement with the oil industry? You tell them your expectations.
Yeah, so for the oil and gas industry, we've developed basically sort of policy guidelines in terms of what we are expecting from the industry itself. So we have sort of developed several points.
Farida, could you move a little bit closer to your microphone?
So I hope this works. I'm not entirely sure whether you can hear me now properly.
Yeah, I can hear you better this way, yeah.
Okay, good. We've developed a policy document in terms of engagement with the oil and gas sector. So we've sort of established 5 different points that we focus on, from, for instance, on governance, where we say, okay, this is what we expect in terms of how boards need to be composed and whether they have any climate-related knowledge on the board as well. So that's a topic that we discuss with companies. We also look at compensation, for instance, so how our board members remunerated, and are, for instance, climate targets included when they in their remuneration policy. But we also look at how sort of climate has basically a sort of a place within the company, and that's what already was mentioned. For instance, the capex that was spent on basically climate topic as well. So I think this is one of the sort of the starting points of engagements. Then, of course, look at target setting. We look at, for instance, the plans that companies have in terms of, let's say, a decarbonization strategy or any elements that they take into account there. We look at the carbon budget. We look at CCS. So there are really different elements that we look at in terms of the engagement.
Yeah. Before you go on, Farida, just let me ask the technicians here. Would it help to switch off the camera? Would that improve the sound? You think? No? Okay, then we just have to continue this because I can hardly hear you, and I'm afraid. Technicians, also, is there anything we can do about it? But the stream is the audience can hear her better, so maybe you can give us somewhat more sound. Okay, sorry, the issue is more here in the studio than at the people's homes.
Good, I'm happy to hear that, so that at least people are able to understand me. So I think that's basically on the engagement approach indeed, and the things that we focus on there.
Yeah. And then in the engagement, so you tell your expectations. You also have to tell them the consequences. So let's first talk about divestment. So how does it look like? You tell a company, this is what we expect from you, and if you don't achieve this in a next number of years, we will divest?
Yeah, so we have, for instance, for the oil and gas sector, we have sort of a transition plan, right? So we ask from companies to indeed go into that transition, and we ask them we have for each company, we have sort of key indicators that we are able to track. So after 3 years, usually we sort of evaluate and see whether companies are on track or not. And if companies are not, basically we can go into the route of divestment indeed. And we've sort of taken that stance already before as well, and we see that companies are not improving basically at certain key sustainability topics, especially when it comes to contributions as well.
Thank you. And then the third tool in the toolbox, voting. How do you decide what to vote? And then let's talk about resolutions, not only about resolution, but also whether or not you vote for board members.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important not only to focus on indeed resolutions, right, but just the regular items on the agenda are quite key as well. And like you mentioned, the board members are specifically a good target. So we have, for instance, voted down several board election proposals and board nomination proposals, just because we believe that the company is not really improving in terms of sustainability or their climate ambition. So we definitely see that as the tool for companies also to react. And voting, it has usually quite an impact because companies are quite responsive when it comes to proxy voting itself, right? So I think that's definitely an interesting tool to use. Also on compensation, we sort of target the compensation plans when we saw that there was no integration of, for instance, climate-related targets in there. And then, of course, later is the shareholder proposals. I have to say we are generally quite in favor of shareholder proposals, especially when it comes to sustainability targets. So that's sort of our general point of view. Of course, we look at like what companies are already disclosing and whether they have any targets in place. But we do believe these are an important element to shake up some stuff with the companies itself.
Yeah, Thank you for your votes for climate resolutions in the last couple of years. This really has given a clear signal to companies like Shell, BP, and Equinor to really improve their and advance their ambitions and really prepare to take action. So thanks a lot for that. As a final question. You're a Dutch-based company, and of course, the resolutions came first to vote at Shell. Is it difficult to vote against the board of the most powerful company in your country?
Well, I'm going to be a bit open here, but no, it's not difficult, right? I do think that if we want to have a debate with the company, if we want companies to move in the right direction, it's quite easy to vote against management and to vote for a shareholder proposal, right? So I don't see any harm in doing that. Of course, companies, and I have to say, we also haven't sort of ran into any issues with engaging with companies where they sort of closed the door on us when we sort of voted down a proposal or sort of supported a shareholder resolution. The same goes for Shell, right? And I think that also speaks positive on their behalf, of course. But I think that's definitely something that we haven't encountered. So we don't see an issue of voting against that.
Okay, thanks for that. But I hear a lot of investors who think that's quite difficult and they're afraid to have not a good relationship with the biggest company in their country, and the same goes, of course, in the UK for BP and for Total in France.
Yeah.
So Frida, thanks a lot for this moment. You will stay with us to be in the panel in like 20 minutes from now. We've also sent a present to you in Rotterdam. It's the book Originals, How Non-Conformists Change the World. It's a theory about tempered radicals. So people who really want to push their agenda but are not too radical to get it done. And so I hope you recognize yourself in this book because you should. So thanks for now. See you later in the
We have one
panel.
question from...
Oh, I'm sorry. We have questions.
Just one so far. Yeah. A question from Colin Tisson. How often has NN divested from oil and gas companies over the last couple of years after failed engagements?
Yeah, we've divested from one company.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's all questions for now.
Yeah, I suppose you can't name the name of the company.
Oh, I can't name the name, but...
Yeah. All right, thanks. See you in 20 minutes, Frida. So now we go from Rotterdam to Paris, actually the outskirts of Paris, if I'm correct. We go to Mark Lewis.
That's right, Mark. Yes, I'm in Saint-Germain-en-Laye on the western side of Paris.
Hi, Mark. Great you join us. Thanks a lot.
Good to see you.
Good to see you again. Yeah.
Great to be with you.
Let me introduce you to the audience. Mark is a long-time observer, a long-time analyst of the energy industry, over 20 years, I reckon. He's working for BNP Paribas, but for the record, he doesn't speak on behalf of BNP Paribas. Mark is an academic, has worked for Carbon Tracker as well, has worked for Barclays, and has worked for TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So you've observed this industry for a long time already.
Yes.
So as an energy veteran, you've seen the large electricity companies decline, such as RWE, E.ON in Germany, losing 50% of their value, basically because they did not change in time. Do you think the oil industry runs the same risk?
Oh, absolutely. No question about it. I mean, what you have with renewable energy, I think, is a very simple proposition. And sometimes the simplest propositions are the hardest to understand. Renewable energy is intrinsically deflationary. That's very different from fossil fuels. If you take oil, you have to go out and explore for it. You have to drill for it. You have to produce it. All of that costs money. And of course, you begin by exploiting the easiest to access resources. Over time, you're then forced to move up the cost curve as those resources are depleted. So the geology of fossil fuels is intrinsically inflationary. Now, compare that with wind and solar. With wind and solar, you don't have to go out and explore for it. You don't have to drill for it. You don't have to produce it. You simply have to build infrastructure to capture it where you already know it's available. And therefore, and it's free at the point of delivery. And therefore, all of the cost, essentially all of the cost, is in the infrastructure. And the more infrastructure you build, the cheaper it gets. It's economies of scale. It's rule number one in the economics textbook, right? There's an economies of scale, very well-known effect. On top of that, you get a technology effect, learning by doing. Now, because of this very radically deflationary nature of renewables, and because now, with the increasing electrification of transport, electrons from solar and wind will in the future increasingly be in head-to-head competition with oil and gas molecules. The oil and gas industry finds itself in exactly the same position that the utility industry found itself in 15 years ago. And I'm afraid we're seeing the same signs of hesitancy and reluctance to radically reshape the business model in a time frame that would be adequate to meeting the threat. And as a result, I think you're already seeing stranded assets. You're already seeing write-downs in the oil industry, and for the first time ever, if this wasn't the wake-up call it needed, then I don't know what is. For the first time ever last year, we saw dividends being slashed across all of the European majors. Of course, the dividends being sacrosanct in the oil industry. That was always the main investment case for holding oil and gas companies, that you get this nice, juicy dividend. In a world of deflationary energy increasingly, you won't be able to compete. And the economics of renewables and the speed with which renewables are growing mean that inevitably the entire global energy system is going to be subject to deflationary pressure over the next 2 decades.
So, Mark, the defense of the industry saying, yes, we've seen the utilities, we've seen the electricity companies struggle, but we are a different business. That doesn't apply?
I mean, I've heard that for many years, and it might not have applied. You might have been able to get away with that 5 years ago, where in practice, the penetration rate of electric vehicles was very low, and you could argue, I've had it argued against me on panels with leading oil and gas executives, oh, it's going to take 2 decades, 3 decades for electric vehicles to really become a mainstream phenomenon, and we have plenty of time to reshape our business models. It ignored 2 things, that dialogue. Number one, the speed of technological change is much greater than the oil industry realized, because they're coming from an industry that's very conservative by nature and has for over 100 years not really changed that much. Yes, there's been massive technological innovation in the oil industry, of course there has, but that's because it's been necessary, because they've had to move up the cost curve.
But that's the technology. Mark, the technology improvement are basically really in the technology to get it out of the ground.
It's incremental,
but not in the business model. The business model is still turning hydrocarbons into petrodollars.
It's incremental, and therefore it's slower compared with the pace of change in electric vehicles, which is technology. But the second point, Mark, is financial markets move much more quickly than the real world, because the whole point of financial markets is they price in the future today. And what's changed in the last 5 years, really the last 2 years, is the perception of the speed with which electric vehicles will be taken up by the broader population. And therefore, the value is already being redistributed across the financial markets, away from fossil fuels and towards renewables and electric car manufacturers. And I think they were very slow to realize how quickly that redistribution of value would happen.
Yeah. But what do you think is happening in the heads of these executives? You know them, you've spoken to them for decades already. You've even been with them to the Vatican, if I'm correct. Why do they fail to see that the same thing could happen to them?
Well, I think there's a couple of things in play here. One is it's human nature. You're familiar with what you've been doing for 30 years. Most of the people running the large oil and gas companies around the world, today are industry veterans. They've been in this industry 30, 35 years, and they've made it to the top. And all of their experience has been based on a time where oil had no competition. There really was no competition for oil in the field of transportation. So it's very difficult for people who've grown up with the rules of the game in a certain framework, all of a sudden to find that the rules of the game are being upended very violently by a new competitor that they didn't see coming, and which, frankly, they don't yet understand how that new competitor operates. And as I said, the dynamics of the new entrant are very different because they have very strong deflationary dynamics, whereas the game they're used to playing is all about very limited competition and inflationary dynamics. It's an absolute revolution. It is very hard to capture the full extent of that if for 30 years you've been playing the game in one way only.
So what should they do? Should they hire young people or even hire you who see the picture and who see how transition works?
Well, I think, yes, young people, I think, hiring young people is a problem for the oil industry now, because there are real problems with recruitment because so many young people now want to go into the technologies of the future and the solutions to climate change rather than what have been the contributors to climate change. So recruitment is actually a real problem for this industry. But I think otherwise there is now sufficient evidence that this is no longer something that can really be debated seriously. They simply have to look at the facts. They have to accept that the rules of the game have changed. Look, denial is a very common human attribute. I have a book here right behind me, this famous study of the psychology of denial. It's a very well-known human defense mechanism, but they have to get through that denial now. There's no time left to be in denial about this problem. The evidence is everywhere. The evidence is physical in the shape that climate change is taking, and the evidence is financial in the pounding that their share prices have been taking. I mean, what more evidence do you need? If you are a rational observer of the world today, then combating climate change is the morally right thing to do, and it's the financially smart thing to do.
All right, that's very clear, Mark, very clear. So let's hope they see the light, and let's hope that or investors will force them to see the light. Let's see if there are some questions from the audience.
Yes, we have quite a few for you, Mark. The first one is from Cynthia Williams, and she wants to know, in utilities, isn't the lack of adequate storage for the renewable energy still a serious problem?
Well, look, as storage becomes more and more necessary, because self-evidently, the more we're using renewable energy, the greater the problem of intermittency becomes. So yes, energy storage, if you like, is the missing link. It's the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle to make net zero possible by 2050 and to allow us to fully electrify using renewable energy sources the world's energy system. And green hydrogen will be needed as well. But yes, energy storage is absolutely key. The good news is we're making big progress on energy storage, and again, it's partly an infrastructure play there as well. So you're going to get this infrastructure come technology dynamics. So you're going to get very strong deflationary dynamics around batteries. You're already seeing that, and other energy storage technologies. And of course, the way we think about batteries, we should be thinking about different kinds of energy storage solutions. Your electric car in the future is going to be a very important source of storage. So there's a lot of flexibility in a renewable energy economy. It is a decentralized energy system and a democratized energy system. These are further benefits that go beyond, the clean air and the environmental benefits we get from it. I mean, renewable energy is a very beneficial public good on many fronts, not just on the crucial problem of climate change. So I think that there may be bottlenecks in the early phases of this transition around storage availability, but we can solve this problem. And if you like, this is really the last of the dominoes to fall, because every other argument that has been made against renewable energy and the scaling up of renewable energy, the cost of renewable energy, has been debunked by economics and technology over the last 15 years. Storage will come at the requisite scale if we make the necessary investments. And I believe at the moment the momentum behind this in markets, amongst investors, and now policymakers as well, because it's crucial we get the policymaker buy-in, is happening. And in the run-up to COP26, it's vital that governments continue to make as strong pledges as they can around all aspects of the energy transition, and storage is key to that.
Thank you, Mark. How many more questions do we have?
Let's do one more question and then go to the next speaker. Yeah.
Okay. Pierre de Rijk, who works for FOE Netherlands on the climate court case against Shell, which demands 45% CO2 reduction in absolute terms by 2030. He wants to know, if we win, how would you judge the risk that Shell is taking, as they would decrease the time that they have to implement the consequences of a verdict?
Yes, well, look, every company it will make their own judgment on essentially, not to sound too cynical about this, but what they can get away with. Yeah. I mean, that's what companies do. Or at least in my experience of being an equity analyst for a long time, that's what companies do. I think it's becoming clearer and clearer with every day that passes, however, that you cannot afford to be complacent on this, and that speed is of the essence. And I think if you look at the announcements we're seeing around the world, the UK yesterday announcing that it's radically increasing its emissions reduction target, 78% now by 2035 compared with 1990. The EU today formalising the 55% emissions reduction by 2030 compared with 40%. You're going to see many governments around the world here increasing the speed here. And the reason why comes back to what I said earlier. It's because it's much easier for governments to make to set ambitious targets when the economics are in their favour. Why did we get a climate change agreement in Paris in 2015, whereas we didn't get one in Copenhagen in 2009? The main reason is that the economics improved very substantially between 2009 and 2015, such that it was easier for governments to set more ambitious targets. And as those economics continue to improve, and as society continues to put greater pressure on the need to confront climate change, what I call this virtuous feedback loop between policy and technology will only accelerate. And that's really the bet they're taking, that this virtuous feedback loop will not accelerate. And I think that's a very risky bet to be making.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks a lot for making this so crystal clear. What's happening, and that change needs to happen very fast. Otherwise, these companies will have the same fate as the electricity companies. There's also a book on its way to your library behind you. Again, Loonshots. It offers a really great model for transition, because it's a very simple model. It's a 2x2 matrix, which basically says you have to have your franchise departments and your innovation department completely separated, but you need to have a lot of interaction, and then that's the only way you can thrive through a transition. So if you don't have much time, just look at page 43, and it's completely clear. So we'll see you in like 20 minutes in the panel. And let's move to California. We're now connecting with Anne Simpson, who's a very early riser. Anne, thanks a lot for joining us, getting up so early for us Europeans. Are you there, Anne?
Yes. Hello, Mark.
All right. Welcome, and thanks for being with us so early. To introduce you, Anne is a managing investment director for Corpus for over 10 years now, and one of the founders of CA100+, Climate Action 100+, the big group of institutional investors now representing over 50 trillion in assets. Bigger than big oil, as I sometimes say. And Anne is chairing the CA100+ since March 31st. So thanks a lot for being with us. Thanks a lot for having one of the 15 leading ladies in the global fight against climate change, according to Time last year. So thanks a lot. And we first have a few questions for you, and then you can join. Then you will also join the investors panel together with Mark and Farida. First question actually is, compared to their US peers, the European oil majors are promising a lot more. They have Scope 3 ambitions, for example. But you were one of the few US investors who voted for the climate resolutions at Shell, BP and Equinor in previous years. Why? Can you explain the audience why you were one of the few Americans who voted for?
Well, thanks very much, Mark. I think the question about voting is a simple one. It's the point at which you move from talk to action. So we've identified that, climate risk is one of the top 3 risks to the system, to CalPERS. And you think we have a portfolio of more than $450 billion. We're investing for over 2 million people. But most importantly, our liabilities are intergenerational. So when you're this big and this long term, there's nowhere to hide. But we don't just view climate risk as something to terrify us, to use your phrase earlier. This is a huge opportunity. So if we're looking at jobs, we're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at investment returns for a pension fund like CalPERS, the opportunities in this transition are huge. So we've got to be thinking about this not just on the risk side, but also on the opportunity side as well. And for us, I would say on the risk, what we did, as some of you know the story, is ahead of the Paris Agreement say, well, rather than just wagging our finger at companies on emissions, we signed up for the Montreal Pledge, which the PRI developed, to work out what proportion of global emissions we actually own in our portfolio. And just in our global equity holdings of about 10,000 companies, we found around 100 companies were responsible for 80% of the emissions. So if we're moving from the why are we concerned about this to how do we do something, the first thing we need to do is focus on these systemically important carbon emitters, as we call them. Now, the issue there is not just to be thinking about the role of investors in relation to the production of fossil fuels. That's one element. But if we're going to bring the demand curve down for fossil fuels, there has to be a transformation in the customer base. So what the demand for fossil fuels brings is the opportunity for transformation in electricity generation, in food, in manufacturing, in transport. I very much like the way Bill Gates wrote about this economy-wide transformation in his book that's just out. He said, how we feed ourselves, how we get around, how we plug in for electricity, how we make things, and how we keep ourselves suitably cool and suitably warm, depending on the season and what part of the world that we're living in. These are the 5 areas where we're going to need transformation. So if you look on the Climate Action 100 Plus list, yes, you'll see oil and gas companies there, but you're also going to see cement, steel making, utilities, car companies, airlines, and companies with very long agricultural supply chains. So for the investor strategy here, you've got to be able to track these emissions from cradle to grave, which is why simply offloading assets isn't going to solve the problem. We've actually got to follow these emissions and make sure that we're sorting out a transformation, not just a sort of a prettification of our portfolios and what we own. And that's a far more demanding project. Now, on the what is to be done, the engagement piece is really important. And as Mark Campanale mentioned, we have just rolled out the first net zero company benchmark for Climate Action 100 Plus. And to your point, Mark, don't get overly excited about the commitments on the European companies. Everyone is on the starting line. We don't find a single company there which is anything other than in the foothills of a very long climb.
No, you're absolutely.
However,
You're absolutely right, and it's the biggest difference between the Europeans and the Americans are that the Europeans are making a lot of promises right now, but you could also say that at least the Americans are honest. They don't promise anything, and they also don't take much action yet.
And the point here is the investors now need to be in the spotlight, because we've seen a growing number of share owner proposals coming forwards, and obviously Follow This has been important in putting proposals forwards. But Climate Action 100 Plus this season is flagging close to 40 different proposals in different markets. But I also think there's something else important going on, which is a realization that the share owner proposal, an advisory vote, is wonderful for signaling, but it's a little bit of a feather duster. It's not going to really drive change that's needed at the pace and scale that we need to, if you like, force some of the tough decisions that need to be made. So I think what we're looking at now is seeing how boards of directors are increasingly in the spotlight for voting decisions. You will have seen last year that quite a lot of investors, CalPERS included, voted against directors, for example, at Exxon and other companies. And I think if we've got to just move this dialogue from the advisory share owner proposal world and into board accountability.
Yeah.
Because until we make sure that we have competence, climate competent boards, independent boards, of course, but also diversity. Because one of the problems we've got in the industry, and I think, Mark Lewis said it well, it's a very old industry. The incumbency effect here is very powerful. So diversity and board refreshment is actually going to be very important to bringing new talent to the table for solving some of these problems. So, one of the things we've just done at Climate Action 100 Plus last week is host a webinar for signatories so that they could meet the candidates who are being put forward at Exxon by Engine One, a small hedge fund with big ideas, but that supported by some major pension funds like CalSTRS in the United States. But it's important that investors begin to leave their fear of flying behind and understand that our role as the providers of capital for the long term means it's not just that we request, we need to require that these transition plans are developed and put in place. And that means board accountability, who's on the board, their competence, their ability to deliver on this. As Frida said a moment ago, compensation or remuneration, as it gets called in Europe, that needs to be aligned with these transition plans. So does political lobbying. Yep. And we also need companies to come forward with their plans on the just transition. Because if we don't make sure that we're taking care of the impact on the workforce and the community and the most vulnerable groups in society, there will be political backlash, which makes the policy agenda harder to deliver. So that brings the second thing that investors need to be very active on, which is advocacy. It's not just the engagement that we need to do with the companies and with managers where we use them externally. We've also got to be advocates for the regulation that's needed. And that's mandatory climate risk reporting. It's removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which are distorting the market in a very unhelpful way. And it's carbon pricing. And without those, it's going to be really difficult for finance to actually really fulfill the promise of driving this transition.
Yeah.
So
you must feel like
tomorrow CalPERS will be at the Biden summit, as you'd expect, and supporting what the new administration is doing. And we're feeling hopeful that the United States has momentum now. Now, it's not all bad news.
You must feel like a chess. You must feel like a chess player if you're playing climate change on so many with so many on so many places. So voting for these climate resolutions in California for European oil majors was basically a no-brainer, as I understand.
Well, we do use our brains. I would say I know that American expression, and I'm not very fond of it. It suggests that you do something without thinking. But the whole point is, if you apply your fiduciary duty, your ability to do the arithmetic, your understanding of the science, then you're going to be making sure that you use all the tools in the toolbox, as Freda calls it, to make sure that you're protecting your members' assets.
All right, thanks. I'm not a native speaker. I was thought a no-brainer was something you don't need to think about it because it's so simple.
Well, you do need to think about it.
Yeah, but you need to think.
Let's return brains to the process. It can't be done on an ideological or sentimental basis. It just won't work in the financial markets.
But thanks a lot.
But I'm not a native speaker of American either, Mark. If that cheers you up.
Yeah, but again,
I'm a foreign import.
Thanks a lot for voting for these resolutions. They were really the change agents. We have seen in Europe that engagement alone doesn't work. There need to be consequences, and voting has really driven the change in Shell, BP, and Equinor. So next month, similar resolution will come to vote at Chevron, Conoco, and P66. Thanks to the Biden administration, who reformed the SEC very fast. We were really surprised that that they didn't waste any time, and now climate resolution are on the ballot of again Chevron, Conoco, and P66. Can you tell already something about your thoughts about these resolutions? They just ask for emission reductions and Scope 3 responsibility, as they did in Europe, and as you know, in the US. Nobody, save for Occidental, has taken any Scope 3 responsibility.
Well, I just want to go back to the benchmark, the importance of the net zero company benchmark at Climate Action 100 Plus is that nobody is covered in glory. No company has actually started to make, for example, the CapEx decisions that are needed. Even a company like BP, according to the benchmark, BP has made the statements and the commitments, and we're very grateful and appreciative of that. But close to 60% of BP's CapEx is simply not lined up with that commitment. So the gap between what is said and what is done is what needs to be closed.
Thanks a lot, Anne. We will see you in the panel in a short time, in 10 minutes. I've also sent you originals by Adam Grant. Please start.
I already have that, but you're very kind. Make a donation.
You have it already.
Maybe there's some very nice schemes for providing books for inmates, for example. But I already have that book. But,
okay. I'm sorry.
And it's a lovely book. Thank you.
Yeah. I love chapter 5 with one of my heroes, Lucy Stone, the first women who kept her own name after marriage in the US, and the women who fought for voting rights. I should have known that you already had that book. I think of something. I think of something else, and you can give this as a present to somebody else, because it's really a great book. So we see you in 10 minutes.
We have a few questions for Anne.
But first we have a few questions.
The first one is from Thomas Larson. Why don't we see more CA100 Plus initiated resolutions now that the CA100 Plus net zero benchmark suggests that very few companies are Paris aligned?
I guess the question is there, what do you mean by the word more?
I think why there's not more resolutions being filed by companies in the CA100 Plus.
Well, there are 40 this season, and we should use resolutions where they're needed.
Yeah.
And remember, the resolutions are a tiny number of the overall proportion of votes. You have votes on directors, on auditors, in some markets on the report and accounts, even on the receipt of the dividends. So you've got to actually look at that bigger picture. But have a look at the Climate Action 100 Plus website, and you'll see the proposals that are being flagged this season. And there's another batch coming out shortly. Great.
And Paul Risman would like to know, Exxon is the poster child of a recalcitrant O&G company. It and Ovintiv were both hit with board challenges this season. If this trend continues, would divestment then become counterproductive?
On divestment, for us, the problem is when you divest, all you do is sell your shares to someone else. And it doesn't have an impact on the emissions. So it depends what your goal is. If your goal is to bring emissions down, then the ultimate step investors need to take is to replace board members.
Yeah.
The ultimate threat, like divestment, I think there are probably quite a lot of companies who'd be rather delighted if Carp was divested.
Yeah,
Because, yeah, that would sort of bring the temperature down a little bit. So, and I also know, one of the big US pension funds who we work very closely with made an announcement of staggered divestment in coming years, and then found that companies said, well, there's no point in talking to you because you're on the way out. Yeah. You're heading for the door. Yeah. You're heading for the exit. So this whole debate about divestment needs to be handled really carefully.
Great. And a final question, if we have time, is...
I think we have to move on now. Just a final remark on the on resolutions. Of course, there are a lot of resolutions filed and flagged by the CR100+, but just you as a chair, I want to give you something for consideration. Please consider for the CR100+ to also flag resolutions filed by other parties. We think we have filed some very important resolutions, and it would be great if the CR100+ would flag them too. I know you can't answer that right now, but this is something for consideration. Let's move to London again, where we have Chris Hone waiting for us. Okay.
Maybe I can ask Anne one more question while we wait.
So I'm asking the technicians. Chris is not on the line yet, so we have to... Shall we do the panel first?
Can you hear me?
Oh.
Chris, good afternoon to you. Welcome to our seminar. Thank you so much for joining us. It's for me personally, it's quite an honor that you are with us, because I can honestly say that without your endeavors as an activist shareholder in the Netherlands, I wouldn't have founded Follow This, because the Children Investment Fund has shown in the Netherlands with our biggest bank, ABN AMRO, that you can have a tremendous amount of influence with just 1% of the shares. So after following that story, I thought, okay, we only need a few % of the shares to influence the oil and gas companies. But that's in the past, when you were an activist shareholder, basically looking what's best for the future of the company. And I think, and now you also have ideas of what's best for the future of the planet as a whole. So yeah, today you are quite a different activist shareholder. You push for climate transition at major companies. So what has motivated this strong stance?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Over a decade ago, I realized climate change was a massive thing, and it became the biggest area for the foundation that I endowed, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And we today are giving away about $150 million a year for climate-related grants to effect change. But it's obvious that companies are the biggest source of pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, 35%, and their general approach is to do as little as they can get away with. And this isn't in the interest of investors, and it's not in the interest of shareholders or governments. And so I've always I saw an opportunity to combine my experience as an activist investor with a desire to, impact the climate agenda here. So what I saw as an activist is that talk, just as Anna had just been saying, talk really doesn't get you very far in activism, and if you don't have something of consequence, and to in effect put some fear into companies that they have to do something. And so I found that the votes at AGMs was a powerful tool to affect change. So in the case of ABN AMRO, the management, I asked the company to sell itself. The management said, go to hell. With 1% of the shares, we put a vote to sell the company. 70% of the shareholders voted for it, and the company was sold for $100 billion. Voting is and shareholder resolutions, I've proven to be a powerful tool. The question is, the detail, what specific type of resolutions and how that plays with director voting.
Yeah, we've seen that now in the last couple of years in Europe, that filing resolutions and voting for resolutions has really compelled companies like Shell first, and then BP and Equinor to take Scope 3 responsibility, to take responsibility for the emissions of their products, which something they refused to do before a substantial number of shareholders voted for a resolution asking for just that. And in Shell, we only needed 6%, in BP only 8%, and in Equinor only 12% to make these companies really cross the Rubicon on Scope 3, because that's has big consequences if you take that responsibility. So you said, yeah, talking is not enough. We need consequences. We need voting. So this AGM season, as you know, there will be 6 climate resolutions on the ballot, 3 in Europe, 3 in the US, asking simply for Paris-aligned targets, or let me phrase it differently, short, medium and long-term targets to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, something we need from the oil industry. We need them to reduce emissions. They're on the ballot at Shell, BP and Equinor, and at the other side of the ocean, Chevron, ConocoPhillips and Phillips 66. So, yeah, what would you advise shareholders to vote on these?
It's very clear, Mark. Shareholders should follow the resolutions proposed by Follow This, and send a clear message that we must have targets. Without targets and near-term targets, 5-year targets are key. We're not going to get anywhere. Otherwise, we'll have vague commitments that don't do anything. And so I think targets and a plan to back up the targets and consequences of failing to meet those targets are fundamental to the change that we need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think targets will drive change. They all have to make radical changes to their business model, radical changes to their investment. The investments have to shift radically from fossil fuels to renewables, and that will only be achieved by hard emission reduction targets. So, yeah, thanks a lot for this endorsement. I hope fellow investors will listen to your voice. Very clear. At the AGMs of Shell and Total, as you know, there are 2 alternative resolutions which come to vote. Basically, both companies say we have a Paris-aligned strategy, and we want you shareholders to mandate that. These strategies are inadequate to achieve the Paris Climate Agreement. They don't result in absolute emission reductions in the short term, and also not in the medium term. So 2030, they only promise to be net zero in 2050. So what would you advise shareholders to vote on these specific resolutions where the companies ask basically for a mandate for the current strategy?
Yeah. It's obvious shareholders should vote against the company proposed plans and against directors. And it's important that the world calls out those investors that don't do so, both through shame and removing business from them, and making it clear that it's absolute greenwashing and hypocrisy for the big fund managers, like the BlackRocks of the world, to say we're doing all this great stuff on climate, but then supporting plans which don't lead to any reductions. And so, I think through our foundation, we're getting very serious now in funding a lot of stuff in the financial space to hold investors accountable for their voting records and highlighting where they are failing and advocating that investors, asset owners, sack them for doing nothing and greenwashing. And so this is investors have to start to realize that they will lose their business if they talk but don't do, or pretend to do something and don't do anything.
So, yeah, you talk about naming and shaming. So what would you advise your colleagues who are leading BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, who to date have never voted for serious climate resolutions and always said, we do engagement, we have a great relationship with the company and we have great conversations, and that's a better way to get them moving, and we don't vote for it because that will ruin our relationship. What message do you have? Let's keep it focused. That's for Larry Fink in BlackRock.
Yeah, sure. The message is you're really bullshitting your investors to say you're doing something if you're not willing to hold it, and you're promising, you're claiming you're holding companies to account, but at the same time you vote for plans that aren't doing anything. And so it's time that investors sack you if you don't walk the walk. So I think that you need to realize there's going to be consequences, and people are there watching, calling you out, and I think this idea that engagement is much more powerful when there are consequences. This is number one lesson of being an activist. And if you're always supporting a company, even if they're not doing anything effective, then it's frankly it's a pathetic excuse that and you're not fooling anyone. So I think that one of the things that needs to happen is a lot more naming and shaming of the fund management industry. Our foundation is going to be funding this, and to draw attention to every vote, every fund manager where they vote for plans which are failing, and don't vote against directors. And so I think the scrutiny is going to step up. I would bet that mandatory disclosure is coming across Europe. It's coming to the US. And with that, it's going to be very hard to justify voting for boards and for plans where the emissions aren't declining.
Yeah, they have done. Yeah, unfortunately, they have done. A lot of big investors publish their votes, and they still include a rationale why they vote against climate targets resolutions. First, because they agreed on the Scope 3 argument. Now they agree that targets, that the companies might have their own strategy, and they have great engagement. But thanks a lot, Chris, to speak out so clearly about this. I hope your colleagues are listening, because we really need the investors industry to drive the change, because the oil majors themselves won't do it on their own accord.
Thank you, Mark.
So, thank you so much. Maybe there are some questions from the audience.
We have a couple.
Yeah.
The first one is from Claudia de Meulemeester. How do you see hedge fund activism embarking on environmental campaigns, given their investment horizon is much shorter than the one for institutional investors?
Not all hedge funds have a short-term horizon. Our fund is has a multi-year, maybe as long as 10-year horizon. So we have a lot of internal capital. We have over $6 billion of internal capital. So we can take a longer-term horizon. And I think hedge funds have a role to play because they're willing to be also do more active things. I think that what's going on at Exxon, where Jeff Urban has gone on the board and Jim Wan has put a slate up, is very important. TCI, we've been filing a lot of resolutions that are on, say, on climate for an advisory vote, which I actually disagree with Anne on CalPERS. I think that if there's an approval vote, a disapproval vote, put to shareholders that says, we, the shareholders, disapprove of your climate action plan because it hasn't reduced emissions, it doesn't do this, it doesn't have targets. I think that is a powerful tool and for change. And so I think the disapproval shareholder AGM vote, disapproval of the climate plan, is going to be a tool, and I think forcing plans out of companies through AGM votes is going to be necessary to file resolutions that say, please disclose why your climate plan, if and how your climate plan does not conform to the CA100 benchmark. So, we're invested in a company, Charter Communications. We filed an advisory vote on them, and we own about $5 billion of stock in them, and a big S&P 500 company. They filed a target for 2035, no short-term targets, and we think it's a classic example of where pressure needs to be brought to bear to force the company to justify why they haven't published near-term targets.
Yeah.
And so, there's going to be a lot more activism from the NGO space. Our foundation is funding activists like Follow This in the US, like As You Sow, to buy shares in hundreds of S&P 500 companies. It's cheap to file there, and start to create a forcing mechanism. So I'm not sure. Maybe I think hedge funds. I'm not sure they are going to be the key to the change, but there are a few like ourselves which are serious about it, and they are sometimes willing to do things which others are not. And we've filed AGM resolutions on a bunch of companies. We've had Moody's, Standard & Poor's, the rating agencies have agreed to a Say on Climate resolution. And we filed one Union Pacific for this AGM, where the company's fighting us. And so there's a lot that can be done in proving concepts like this, like disapproval votes. And so I think hedge funds, there are certain hedge funds which will have a role.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for being so vocal about this. I think we really need prominent figures like yourself to convince others. Thanks for your endorsements of our resolutions. Really means a lot. And there's also a book on its way to you. I've no idea if you've read it. It's The Prey. It's about the ABN AMRO. Have you read it?
I haven't, but I know of it. I've heard of it. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's you can find your name in the index a lot of times. So
thank you. Thank you.
thanks a lot for joining us, and looking forward to work with CIFF and Say on Climate in the future.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
So we're running out of time. I'm just looking at, but we can continue for another 10 minutes. Yeah. Sorry, what did you? Oh, Frida has to go.
Yeah, I'm under pressure, as time pressure as well here, Mark.
Okay. Oh, my apologies. So, how much time do you have left, Mark?
I could do 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, let's do it in 5. And Farida? And Anne?
Yeah, 5 minutes is also possible for me.
Okay, and is Anne still around?
I think she left.
Okay, now let's then discuss with you, Farida and Mark. So basically we have 5 questions, so let's discuss about that as quick as possible. So the first one is just for the record. Has any oil major a Paris-consistent strategy in your opinion? A yes or a no will do, so then we can move to the next question.
I don't think so yet. No, I don't think so yet.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And do you think these oil majors will take initiative on their own to change course?
No.
I would also say no. I mean, I don't think they would have moved as fast as they had if they hadn't got the clear signal from the stock market and from votes in AGMs.
All right, thanks a lot. So that's already answered half of the next question. What do you think? Which tools? So we have talked about 3 tools in the investor toolbox: voting, divestment, and of course engagement. Do you think to get this change happen, we need all these 3 tools? We cannot rely on only one of them.
Yeah, I would say so. I do have sort of, like, I think for us voting is probably quite key to achieve change, right? So I think that's probably a very important tool, engagement as well, especially to get companies and for them to understand exactly what we're trying to reach. I think divestment is absolutely last resort when things cannot be achieved. Like Anne said as well, if you divest, you no longer have capital and you don't know who's buying the shares or the bonds or whatever. So I think that's definitely something that you always have to take into account. Somebody else is going to pick it up and whatever you need to do with it. But I do think for us it is also an important element as a last resort.
I hope the investors watching get this message that we really need every tool in the toolbox to get them moving. They won't move on their own accord. So thanks for that. So again, very clear. If I understood, we need engagement and we need voting. I can say that Anne, who left us, was about to say we don't divest because they will be popping the champagne corks if we divest. So she believes in voting and engagement. But I fully agree with you too and thanks for confirming that, because I think that's an important message for the investor community, that engagement alone will not do the job. So we have a few minutes left. So do you think the all executives you meet now, do they know enough about the energy transition? I think Mark already answered the question, but you may want to repeat that.
I would just add that, I think the speed of change is the key here. And for people who've been used to playing the game in a certain way, it's much more difficult. We have this phrase in English, I'm sure you have a Dutch equivalent: you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I don't think that's necessarily true, but it takes longer. And, that's the complication we're up against here. It's psychological as much as everything else. With that, Mark, unfortunately, I'll have to jump because I'm required on this other call. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. Thanks a lot.
And pleasure. See you soon.
Farida also has to go to another call, I'm afraid. So thanks a lot.
Thank you as well, Mark.
And then
thanks, Mark.
So thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks Anne also in California. I promised 1.5 hours. It is 5 minutes more. but I hope investors are prepared for the AGM season. I just have a few closing remarks. When I started Follow This, I sometimes dreamt of an epiphany of an oil major CEO. These men, they're all men, save for the CEO of Occidental. Most of them have children, and I was always dreaming of that they would have an emotional debate with one of their children, a sleepless night, and then see the light, and then go back to the office and say, yes, I see this energy transition. I'm gonna put my company on in the energy transition. We're gonna thrive in the energy transition. But the fact is, and I just want to show you this picture, these are the hard facts. No oil major is Paris-aligned yet. None of them has a short-term target to decrease emissions enough to be on a Paris-aligned pathway. None of them has a medium-term target to be on a Paris-aligned target, and none of them has investments which could be explained as Paris alignment. And that's not what Follow This is saying. This is just what the CA 100 Plus latest benchmark shows. I'm just showing you a graph with the 4 most important indicators, targets, emission reduction targets, and investments. None of them gets a yes from the CA 100 Plus. And we have to all be very aware that some of them now promise a 2050 target, and say, okay, now we have to implement a new strategy. We will be net zero in 2050, but we're going to implement a new strategy which will increase emissions in the case of BP, and most others say it might decrease, it might increase. We're only going to change our carbon intensity. And I think we have to conclude that this is, I just want to show you this picture. This is a general picture of where the oil industry, most oil majors are at now. So just to remind you, at the beginning of the talk, we need to reduce emissions by almost 45% to have any chance to meet the Paris Climate Agreement, the 1.5 degree target, and at least 25% to be on a 2 degrees pathway. No oil major has promised and has targets to decrease emissions in the next decade. Again, they're all promising, have a great promise for 2050, but no immediate consequences. And in 2050, I'm in my 80s. I'm not going to leave my retirement home and go to visit an oil major executive in his retirement home and say, you broke your promise. They need to act. They need to act now. And we think they can only act when there's very strong engagement and when there's voting for climate resolutions. We've proven that in Europe. If you look at this table, you will see that we started with Shell with 2.7%, nothing happened, 6.3%. Then Shell suddenly set Scope 3 targets. And every time our resolution came to vote, oil majors first said that's unreasonable or unnecessary. And every time a minority of shareholders voted for it, last year 14.4 to 27%, every time they made a new target, a new promise. We even proved with Shell in 2019, where we, in cooperation with what we call the supporting 6, the 6 Dutch investors who voted for a resolution, we withdrew our resolution in 2019. Nothing happened, no new target. Only when we filed the resolution again, Shell came with a new target. So, concluding, I said 2 words were important for me during this seminar, urgency and agency. I think every investor knows the urgency now, but I hope you all realize that you have the agency, that you should be the one to steer them in the right direction, and this has to be done by engagement and voting. So, urgency and agency, and I wish you a good AGM season. Thank you for your attention.